أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد فقد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الحكيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ويسألونك عن الروح قل الروح من أمر ربي وما أوتيتم من العلم إلا قليلا آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات على محمد. Your second salawat for love of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad. And your loudest salawat for ta'jeel faraj sahib al-asr wa zaman ajjal Allah ta'ala. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بذكرنا المساء بآل Muhammad. May Allah increase in our reward for commemorating the difficulties of Ali Muhammad. These majalis that we attend, they serve a variety of different purposes, including the introduction to various aspects of our education that we wish to have. Our goal in these next three majalis that inshallah we have together is a discussion around the concept of tazkiyatun nafs, the purification, the improvement of one's nafs. This conversation around the nafs comes from a reality and a necessity of discussing, especially in the culture that we live in, that is a very material culture. Our environment promotes the understanding of the world through the material five senses, and at points in time, intentionally or unintentionally provides neglect to the presence of a soul within a person. Our goal tonight is the inkishaf, or the awareness, and improving our awareness of the presence of the soul within itself. And then inshallah tomorrow night, more of the attributes and how we will inshallah then improve our ability to interact with and work with our soul over the next 3 nights will be the goal of our discussion. In the topic of the discussion that we begin, the concept of the soul. The soul is one of the two composites that makes up a human being. Our physical body being one aspect, and our soul, the spirit that comes into the human body, being the second. When Allah describes the soul, He tells us in Surah Al-Isra, the verse that we began our discussion with, verse number 85, they ask you about the soul. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. They will ask you about the soul. قُلِ الرُّوحِ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. Say the soul comes by the command of your Lord. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. And we did not give you knowledge of this except for a little bit. The explanation that comes with this explains that there are two aspects of Allah's creation that He has made in this world. One is known as Alim al-Amr and the other is known as Alim al-Khalq. To understand this, the first thing that we take a look at, which is an interesting conversation that comes as a precursor to this discussion, is that in the Quran, as well as the other Abrahamic faith traditions, is a comment that said that God created the earth in 6 days. Even in the Quran, there's a comment, there's a verse which mentions وَخَلَقَ الْأَرْضَ وَالسَّمَاءَ فِي سِتَّةِ أَيَّامٍ. And we've mentioned this, that ayyam in this situation doesn't literally refer to the days of this world, because the days of this world are measured by one rotation around the sun. Now when the sun doesn't exist, how can we say that the day exists? Ayyam in the Arabic language refers to a period of time. Yom is a period of time, which in our contemporary understanding has been labeled as a day of the rotation of this earth around the sun, around its axis. Not around the sun, that's the year, right? So bear with me, okay? You guys have to keep me awake. All right? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. If you're asleep, then I'm going to sleep, huh? You stay awake, I stay awake, okay? The idea of the earth rotating on its axis once counts as a day, but when the earth itself is coming into creation, we know that the reference of yawm and sittati ayyam refers to 6 time periods or 6 phases that the earth went through before its process of creation. One of the questions that not just our youth ask, but even our adults ask is about the concept to say, why did Allah, who is khaliqun likulli shay, the creator of everything, the one who is la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, there is no power except that by Allah, why did Allah need 6 days or 6 periods to bring the earth into creation? Which points to a bigger conversation that talks about even the creation of man and this earth goes through phases. Nothing happens accidentally or as a miracle that we say that something wasn't and suddenly it was. When we want to talk about the presence of a tree, we see that a tree itself is created over a period of time. It's not to say that, for example, one day we wish there was a tree and the next day there is a tree. We say, no, there's a process by which this item comes into creation. The same we say about anything that exists, it comes through a period of creation. Now this becomes a point of conflict for some Abrahamic traditions. For example, when they look at the earth and they see fossils and they see, for example, dinosaurs and they see, for example, all of these things and they say, these are things that have been in the earth for billions of years. They say, but our tradition tells us that, for example, Adam alayhi salam came 5,000 years ago and nothing was here before him. So they come into conflict with science because science says 5,000 years ago the earth has been here for over 1 billion years. And they say 4.2 billion years roughly. They say, no, that's not possible. Allah told us, God told us that Adam came 5,000 years ago, so before that nothing was here. So then science comes back to these Abrahamic traditions and says, then how do you explain what we're seeing in the earth? And they reply, God's testing you. Do you have faith? That this is just a test, it's to trick you, to not have faith in Him. Islam doesn't bring this perspective. Rather, Islam says Allah creates in 2 distinct formats. One is known as Alim al-Amr, and the other is known as Alim al-Khalq. Alim al-Khalq is that which exists within the material world. And anything that exists within the material world, Allah created it through a process and created it through a system which can be measured and understood and impacted and touched and felt and traced back. And the intention of this aspect of creating in Alim al-Khalq was with the intention of presenting before you the signs of the Creator in the earth. So that one, when he would look out at the earth and would look at everything that exists, would acknowledge and understand that an intelligent Creator who's brought it into existence. Look and see how Allah Himself mentions this in Surah Al Imran, verse number 190. إِنَّا فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Allah says, certainly in the creations of the heavens and the earth and of the night and the day are signs, لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, for those who are thoughtful. And Allah is telling you that if you look at this earth, you look at the heavens, I've given you instruction that you can see them and see that my presence is in them. And Allah continues, who are the ulil albab? Who are those who are thoughtful about the aspect of what Allah has created? He continues in verse 191. He says, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقَعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Allah makes the statement in the next verse. He says, what is the consequence of you seeing my signs in this earth? He says that those who can see my signs in this creation of this heavens and the earth are those who think about Allah when they are standing, sitting, and lying on their sides. And they think about the creations of the heavens and the earth, and they come to the conclusion and they make the statement, رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا. Oh Allah, you did not create anything in this without intellect, or you did not create anything that is void or wasteful. فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Then save us from the fire of hell. The material world as it exists around us is intended for us to be able to see the signs of the Creator and come to Him and to know that Allah is present. The concept that our children are sometimes taught in school, but more often it's avoided, is a concept referred to as intelligent design. Intelligent design is a theory that says that the same way that when I look at this chandelier, or when I look at this fan, or when I look at this mimbar that I'm sitting on, I know that a person was careful, thoughtful, and there is an intelligent being who designed this item for it to come into existence. And the presence of this item tells me that a creator who is more intelligent than this item exists, who brought it into existence. And that through the looking at this earth, we come to the conclusion that there is someone who created this. This was the intention that Allah intended by allowing us to see the process of creation. The same is where Allah describes in the Quran the creation of man. Where He describes and He says, you were a drop of semen and we made you into a clot of cells, then we grew you into flesh, then we made for you bone, then we spread skin over the bone, and then we brought you into existence and into life. Allah gives the complete description of how a man comes into existence or a person comes into existence, with the intention that when you look at this world with your five senses, you see the presence of Allah around you. Which is why there are examples where when atheists come with this argument, that our ulama have disproven this argument many times. There's one which I might have shared with you before, but it's always worth sharing because whenever we mention our ulama, we all learn something from it. One is the story of Allama Hilli. Allama Hilli, those who know, is the one who is responsible for making the entire nation of Iran Shia. That if today Iran is a place where the lovers of Ahlul Bayt reside, it's because of the efforts of this one scholar. Now understand something. When you look back at some of the older books, that all of those who had a hatred for the Ahlul Bayt and wrote against the Ahlul Bayt actually came from Iran. So the impact of that scholar on the nation of Iran is something so great that it became a place from where those who had animosity towards Ahlul Bayt became those who have greater love for Ahlul Bayt than many people in this world. These are the efforts of Allama Hilli. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Which is why I understand something. When you go to, for example, the door, one side is the grave of Allama Hilli and the other is this grave of Muqaddis Ardabili. This isn't a place that a person gets to except by their true devotion to Allah and the love of Allah through Ahlul Bayt. So what Allama Hilli has done and accomplished for the sake of Islam is something unique and special. So, as it may happen, an atheist of the Greek philosophical schools traveled through the Middle East and came to the kingdom of Persia and came to the king with the intention of saying that I am an atheist, I wish to debate with your greatest theist that you have. The advisors of the king turn and tell him that this guy is very dangerous. He's been to many other places and he's caused much harm and damage. And the king, his interest is, the basis of his kingdom is on the fundamentals of Islam, that Islam needs to be protected and preserved within his region. So he says to them, then who shall we have debate him? And they say that if Allama Hilli is in the area, there's no one better than him. So they send a messenger to Allama Hilli who happened to be in a village, and they said, the king has requested that there is an atheist who has come to debate on the presence of Allah, and he's asked that you come and debate him. Allama Hilli says, okay, we'll fix the time for Friday at 6 p.m. Say, no problem. So the news goes out into the towns. The people gather to see the munazira, to see the debate amongst two great scholars. They're told of this famous Greek atheist who has come and that Allama Hilli will be defending the religion of Islam. Sure enough, the people gather, the court is full. 6 o'clock comes, no Allama Hilli. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. Maybe 3 hours later, Allama Hilli walks in and says, oh yeah, what are we doing here? And the atheist turns to the king and he says, why is your scholar late? The king turns to his vizier and he says, why is the scholar late? And they turn to Allama Hilli in the middle of the court and they say, Allama Hilli, you were given the time of 6 p.m. You set the time. Why weren't you here? And Allama Hilli says, oh, you see, Safar, oh man, you have a hard time accepting that a boat can come into existence on its own, but yet you've come here to argue with me that this whole world came into existence on its own? In one statement, he showed the inaccurate ideology of this atheist of saying that this world can come into its own existence by showing what that would look like on a small scale. That as we can't believe that this mimbar, that fan, that light could come into existence on its own, then how can we imagine that something as great, as diverse, as large, as developed, as unique as this earth could come into existence on its own. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sallu ala Muhammad. Therefore, alim al-khalq, and the creation of anything that our five senses interact with, is not something that we say is a miracle that cannot be understood. It is still a miracle. But Allah has made it such a miracle that by looking at it and analyzing it, the miracle of it is to see the intelligent designer who is behind the creation and bringing that item into existence. So that whether man finds his way to the teacher or man is absent from the teacher, the Creator has introduced Himself to you and has put within you the idea that you need to reach Him. That every human being possesses this ability to acknowledge that one has created this earth and that it is for everyone, whether or not they get access or they can come to the ones who guide to the way of Allah or not. Now this inshallah will be tomorrow's discussion. We'll talk about this aspect of guiding. Today we continue with the idea of this soul. So from the one aspect we understand that Allah's alim al-khalq, the world of creation, is something within which everything was created over a period of time, including the earth, which is created over 6 phases. That we said, while it's described as ayyam, a yom prior to the existence of this earth, referred to a period of time. That Allah says even this earth came into existence over a period of 6 periods. The existence of the universe, where Allah talks about that everything was once hot and condensed and then we opened it apart and spread it. There is no problem with us pondering over and thinking about how did this earth, how did this universe come into existence? What are the means by which this universe was brought into existence? One of the very plausible theories that exists for the existence of the universe talks about the idea of what's called the Big Bang Theory. Are you guys okay? Because we're going to talk a little bit. We haven't gotten to our maqsad yet. Inshallah, we're going to get to our topic very quickly, but this is something that's relevant in some respects as well too, and it introduces our topic. When we talk about even the idea of the Big Bang Theory, there's no problem with us believing that the concept of something like the Big Bang exists. The concept of the Big Bang says what? It says that when we look at the universe, when we look at space as it exists, we see 2 attributes present within it. That it is constantly expanding and it is constantly cooling. That implies that there must have been a time where everything was hotter and was more condensed. And at some point in time, it split apart and it started the process of expansion. Now, within itself, this theory was said to have brought into the idea that, okay, fine, that space is what exists. And to the extent where some people said that even the 7 heavens that Allah describes are all contained within this one space. And that there are different levels of the space and within it is all contained here. However, recently they've come to new conclusions as well too that imply that space is just one of the 7 heavens that Allah talks about. How? They came to the conclusion, they said, listen, if we take a hot cup of tea, don't think about the hot cup of tea, stay with me, and we drop that hot cup of tea, it is something that is hot and condensed in one location. When we drop it and it falls, majority of the tea concentrates in one location and then it splatters to others. They said if something exists in nothing, this is how it would happen, that one place would be more hot and dense and then the rest of it would be cooler the further away you got from the point. But they said when we look at the universe, we find a problem. That the universe is uniformly hot everywhere. There's no one place that is hotter than the others. The second thing is that the same way when we drop that cup of tea, again focus, don't go to sleep on me on a cup of tea, that the material from the cup of tea would be concentrated in one location. But rather what we see when we look at the universe is that the matter is equally spread out everywhere across the universe and there is no one dense point from which it began. They said this gives us an explanation that something existed before the Big Bang. And what happens in the Big Bang is that this, the way we see matter and heat spread out, it's as if it equally spread out simultaneously in an enclosed space. The implication of this is to say that this is one space that Allah has created and specified and spread equally simultaneously in one motion within a larger space that exists outside of it. And we have, as of yet, we're uncovering these aspects that it may be possible for us as humanity to see that when Allah talks about the seven heavens, we may someday be able to acknowledge the presence of at least a second heaven that exists outside of this space. Up until now, humanity as in its total has only been able to acknowledge that space has a boundary and it exists, we haven't seen it yet. What exists outside of that space boundary, we don't know yet. But Allah has allowed us the ability to ponder over these aspects, to know about these aspects by creating all of this that we see in Alim al-Khalq. I hope I haven't frightened anyone. We're okay? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. There is no shame or problem with us discussing matters of science within the majlis of Ahlul Bayt. Our Ahlul Bayt were teachers and masters of all knowledge. And our understanding of ourselves is based upon our ability to be able to take what we know in the world that we exist in and what our faith teaches us and make sure that the two resonate and make sense. So there's no harm in this conversation. From the other aspect, we talk about what is alim al-amr, or that the creation of Allah that He brings about by His command. This creation that Allah brings about by His command is the one that when Allah talks about in the Quran, where He says, إِنَّمَا إِذَا أَمْرُهُ إِذَا أَرَادَ شَيْءٍ أَنْ يَقُولَ لَهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونَ. That Allah says, when I intend something, I command for it and I say to it, be, and it is. This aspect of Alim al-Amr is associated with those aspects of Allah's creation that exist outside of our five senses' ability to be able to measure them, to touch them, to be able to interact with them. And the clear demonstration of this that Allah brings about and mentions is this soul, where He says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. They ask you about the spirit. Tell us about the spirit. Teach us about the spirit. قُلِ الرُّوحِ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. Say that the soul comes into existence by the command of Allah. That Allah, when He commands something to be, it comes into existence immediately. And there is no aspect within the material five senses that we have the ability to measure this, to weigh this, to look at its color, to understand it. It exists because Allah has commanded it into existence. From amongst the examples of this are as well the malaika, which is why we don't see the angels. They don't interact with us in our senses. We can't tell if they are present around us or absent from amongst us. Why? Because they are something that exists by the command of Allah. And the same is true of our souls within ourselves. Allah has joined these two items together, that the body within itself, we can take the material and put it together. We can borrow something from here, we can borrow something from there. Humanity has told stories of this concept, whether you look at Frankenstein or all of the science fiction that exists. The implication is that I can take the material and bring it together, but when the question comes, what brings it to life? That is something that Allah has reserved for Himself and not something that we can replicate, duplicate, or create in our own processes. Why? Because Allah has said, وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. We did not give you knowledge about how this works and operates except for a little. Therefore, our acknowledgement and understanding is that the soul exists and is present within us. Humanity within itself is aware of this soul and is aware of the presence of this soul. However, it tries to hide its presence. It tries to ignore its presence because it's something it cannot quantify. But within our own communication is the acknowledgement that the soul is present. When a person speaks, for example, and they say, I heard with my ears, I saw with my eyes, I thought with my brain. Who is the I that I'm referring to? If anything, we would say that it's the brain that's thinking. My brain thought. No, we say that I used my brain as a tool to accomplish a goal, which tells us that something exists within me that I'm aware of, that uses this body as a tool to be able to interact with the environment that I live in. Man acknowledges the soul is present, but we hide this reality from ourselves. But it's present in our own speech. That I know that I am something that exists outside of this body, and that this body is something that is attached to me. Now, you guys are okay? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa. I'm going to take maybe 20 more minutes from your time, inshallah, just to explain this so that we can begin the conversation, so that we understand how it is that our conversation tomorrow, of how we interact and fix this soul, and how do we acknowledge the parts of this soul, and how do we repair this soul. The first is the awareness. To do tazkiyatun nafs, I have to be aware of the presence of my nafs. Today's goal is that we have awareness of this nafs. In the concept of the awareness of this nafs is this first aspect we've established, that it exists. And it exists outside of the realm of my five senses because Allah has created it from His command. And that which He creates from His command is not something Allah has given me the ability to trace, to acknowledge, to understand, to manipulate. But what He has given me from alim al-khalq and the material world, I have the ability and the permission to do anything I want with it. I can learn about it, I can manipulate it, I can interact with it, and there is no problem with it because Allah has created it as a means for me to build a relationship with Him. But alim al-amr that Allah presents is something that when He limited its knowledge to us, He did not limit for us the ability to be aware of it and its impacts, but rather that we need His guidance to find how to interact with it correctly. The first thing we see is, how do we know that the soul is present? You see, the soul and the body are two elements that are constantly interacting with one another. That these two elements together bring about this one human being, which means that at times my physical body is impacting my soul, and at other times my soul is impacting my physical body. There are states of the soul that we know exist around us, but we don't pay attention to the idea that it is a spiritual state. We think of it only as a physical state. How? Understand something. When we look at, for example, certain states of emotion, they are states that exist within the soul, not the body. Why? Because the manifestation of that emotional state is different from person to person, which explains that an emotional state is a spiritual state. For example, the concept of fear. When a person feels fear, they show it and manifest it in different ways. For example, a person who is in a state of fear may, for example, run away. Another person may, for example, freeze in place. Another person may begin to speak very quickly. Another person may become silent. Each of these unique manifestations tell us that it's not a physiological state that's coming upon me, rather it's a spiritual state that is manifesting through me and through my body. The same is true of happiness. That a person who feels happiness may, for example, become very generous, may, for example, become a pleasant personality. A person may do very many different things that we would say that this unique person reflects their happiness through this action, which tells us that this is the presence of a spiritual state that manifests differently in each human being. So we see that the spirit shows and manifests and interacts with our body by showing us various things that we see that are unique to each individual by these states. The same is true when the body interacts with the soul. When, for example, something physically pains my body, my personality changes. How it changes varies. I may, for example, when I'm sick, you may find me to be, for example, someone who is very upset about things, someone who may be very depressed about things. Other people, when they are sick, they take the responsibility of accomplishing many tasks. Other people, when they are sick, they want to be pampered. Other people want to be left alone. Each of these conditions points to the reality that when my body is afflicted with something, my soul responds in a different way. That these two items are constantly interacting with each other. If I want to better understand myself, and the statement of our Holy Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he explains, he says, struggling with oneself is the cost of entrance into heaven. You understand what that means? That means one of the biggest responsibilities that we have is this tazkiyatun nafs. That struggling with myself to control my nafs is the cost of entry into paradise. If I want to go to heaven, one of the responsibilities I have is both to acknowledge this spirit that's present within me and learn to control it. Learn to be able to manipulate it so that I reach the goal that I intend. This is why this reality of the soul and the body interacting with each other is something that Islam is both cognizant of and trains us for, to be able to build a good, successful life and entry into heaven. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The idea that the body and the soul communicate with each other is given to us in Islam in a number of different ways. When we look at the 5 daily prayers, these 5 daily prayers are nothing as a favor to Allah. Allah does not need our prayers. We are the ones who are in need of our prayers. The prayer, this salat, is something that ensures the connection of the body and the spirit together. We have to pray 5 times a day. We have to pray this Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha to ensure that this connection is active. They say that I do a favor to Allah, na'uzu billah, or that I do, for example, a good deed, for example, by performing my wajibat. No. By performing my wajibat, I simply maintain the fact that I'm a human being. That I have these 2 elements and I acknowledge them together. How? Look at how Allah explains the salat. Inna salata tanha anil fahsha'i wal munkar. Allah is giving you the demonstration and explaining to you in this Quran that I have anointed this prayer as a physical action that impacts your spirit and your soul. That by performing this prayer, you will protect yourself from indecency and sin. How does that happen? Indecency and sin are those actions that the soul chooses to have the discretion to perform by using the body. The same way we said that fear is an action that a man that comes about in a physical essence of a spiritual desire, the same way sin is something that the soul desires and the body then performs. And Allah says that if you want to control this aspect of your soul and improve your soul and cleanse it from these sins, turn around and perform this prayer. Turn around and ensure that this prayer is something that you perform so as to ensure that the connection between these 2 and your awareness of your soul remains within your body. The same way, for example, when Allah describes and explains the Quran and the importance of the Quran. وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَلَا يَزِيدُ الظَّالِمِينَ إِلَّا خَسَارًا. Allah says we sent down from the Quran that which is a shifa, a protection and a cure for the believers. How is it a cure? It contains within it no antibiotics that anyone has ever seen. There is no pill that's associated with. I know we have Dr. Saab here as well as others too who can speak to the medicine of it, but the description of Allah describing a cure for these problems is the idea that within the Quran He has put something in there that is a medication for your soul, to protect your soul and cure it from the sicknesses and diseases that are present in it. Which is why the Quran becomes an